Good evening. You're watching Asia in Review, and this is part two of our special on mediating in zones of terror with Mr. Al Santoli, who's here with us. Thank you for spending the time with us, Al. As we mentioned to you in the first segment, Mr. Santoli is about to receive a very significant award or order from the President of the Philippines for his work in humanitarian exercises in the very troubled and very poor southern areas of the Philippines, Mindanao, Zamboanga, and other areas to the south there. And at the end of our last program, we were talking about one of the building blocks of Al's career, and that was his involvement with the Reagan Team B, which was just an open door attitude towards experts or people who had expertise in areas of violence and terror during the Cold War. And Al, let's start off here with the piece that's kind of a transition piece that takes you out of Southeast Asia into Afghanistan, and that is your initial involvement in Cambodia and Laos. So you move, or in addition to your refugee work in those areas, you start to get involved in chemical, biological weapons.
Reporting on, not
Reporting
getting
on.
involved.
Yeah, that's right. Reporting on. All right. So what is that all about?
Well, at the time, the Russians were doing experimentation, and to effect, because they were getting their tails kicked because of the Stinger missiles and other things.
No, this is in Southeast Asia now.
Okay, and in Southeast Asia, the Vietnamese were not having a very easy time of it in Laos, and they started using mycotoxins, which is not it's kind of comes from grain. The Russians had been developing this, passed it on to the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese were using it against the tribal people in Laos. In 1982, I did a cover story on Parade about this. So there was just a handful of journalists at the time, from New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and then my Parade story, that had focused on this and made it known that this was not some kind of natural occurrence. But although the weapons came from natural sources,
Okay.
they were combined with chemical and aerosol disposal.
So give us an example of one of those early chemical, biological weapons that you encountered in Southeast Asia.
Well, the ones that were the best known, and I was interviewing people whose communities were affected, were it was called yellow rain, which was really mycotoxins.
Mycotoxins.
Myco. And in Eastern Europe, it grows on wheat.
Okay.
It's like a fungus that's highly lethal. And there was no previous epidemiological presence or knowledge of this ever occurring in Southeast Asia before the Vietnamese were trying to exterminate the Lao Hmong people. The Hmong was the tribe. And we ran into some difficulty. And also this was being used as well, and much worse things in Afghanistan, because there...
Wait. Save Afghanistan.
Okay.
Just finish up. Let's finish up with Southeast Asia.
And there were many tribal peoples that were coming down with all kinds of physical symptoms that had never occurred before in the medical history of that area, always following disposal of these types of powders from helicopters flown either by Russians or Vietnamese. And anyway, this was happening.
Was a genocide attempt by the Vietnamese to exterminate the Hmong minority.
It wasn't as much genocide as to drive them out, to create terror so that they would have to leave. Because the same way the Russians could not fight the Afghans in the mountains, the Vietnamese were having one heck of a time fighting the Laotian tribal peoples in the mountains.
Okay.
And this was a way of driving them out. And of course, many of them couldn't swim, and they had to cross the Mekong River with no bridges, and thousands drowned, or they were shot by the communist forces trying to flee. And then there was a handful of Western organizations, and the Thais were somewhat generous most of the time in allowing them to have refugee camps and first asylum right across the river, but it was always a tough struggle. So this, at the same time, the Russians were using much heavier stuff in Afghanistan that was recombinant DNA from snake poisons from Africa. And I say this for a reason, is because there were scientists that defected from the Russian biological weapons program who described these weapons. And when you looked at the symptoms of how people died, horrific deaths, where the entire body would turn black within an hour or two.
Jeez.
This happens from black mamba snakes.
Okay.
When a black mamba bites you, it turns all of your arteries into jelly in your internal organs, and the snake starts dissolving and eating you. And the Russians combined this with some very microscopic aerosol
Okay.
so that it could penetrate gas mask or penetrate through the skin. And they were using this against the Afghans in the mountains, yeah. And this is old stuff now, because this was happening, 30 years ago?
Was that type of a weapon being used by the Vietnamese in
No.
Laos?
No, this was strictly by the Russian army. They wouldn't let anybody touch this, because it was so much against any convention
Okay, so it
and
sounds to
UN.
me, sounds to me like you've moved into Afghanistan, but have we?
That was because of journalism. In terms of the relief work,
Okay.
it was Southeast Asia, but in terms of the journalistic work, and also for those of us that understood at that time, the Cold War was going to be affected heavily by two places in particular, Afghanistan and Poland. Because you also, and this was the other part of it, Ronald Reagan believed that every person mattered and that he would not throw people away. And he went into an alliance with the Pope in terms of supporting the solidarity movement in Poland. At the same time, he was working with the Muslims in Afghanistan and the animists and the Christians in Africa and the Christians in Latin America and the Buddhists in Cambodia. So there wasn't this business about if somebody's a certain religion, we like them, and if another one, we don't like them. It was very eclectic and open with a common aggressor. Now, what makes it so difficult today is that everything is so fragmented and diverse. The Chinese are starting to act up, but it's not at the point yet where you could say, oh, there's a common aggressor. And so you have all these civil wars, civil strife, you've got nature unpredictable, there's all of these various elements involved.
Sure.
But what can be still learned from that period of Ronald Reagan is that there needs to be a unified process by which people who believe in freedom stand together. That's why what affected Asia America Initiative, even though most everybody in my organization is not an American, the principles of America is our mission statement.
Interesting.
That human dignity is the centerpiece of national security, that every person matters.
Your organization in the Philippines, Al, let me ask you this. You have how many local Filipino volunteers?
Over 1,000.
1,000
Yeah.
Filipino
Yeah,
volunteers?
Yeah, almost everyone under the age of 28.
Fascinating. It's just
As
fascinating.
young as elementary school. And they do projects. I mean, it's not like, oh yeah, they're kids who just kind of hang out. They do feeding programs, mentoring programs of their classmates. We have kids, children of police officers, helping children of people who live in the slums just outside of the police headquarters who eat from garbage. They do 1 or 2 days. The kids of the police officers do, they collect garbage and they sell it, like plastic bottles and
Okay,
whatnot,
recycling.
recycling. And then they go out to the local McDonald's or Jollibee, which is like fast food there, and they buy hamburgers and chicken, and once or twice a week they feed their classmates who eat garbage at least once or twice a day because there's no food in their households because they're so stinking dirt poor. So we work not just in Mindanao, but we're also doing a lot of work in Manila, where incidentally in Metro Manila there's 2 million Muslims.
Let's not forget that, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Mediating in Zones of Terror with Mr. Al Santoli. And Al, let's go back to Afghanistan for a moment, because there has to be some kind of a building block for the work that you currently do with Asia America Initiative in the Philippines. that's as a result of your work in Afghanistan. So what were you doing in Afghanistan?
Well, the key work, and it wasn't just as a journalist, but when I was working in congressional staff.
And so that comes in the 1990s that you.
That's when bin Laden went back.
Okay.
And the Afghans had been abandoned, and they were left at the mercy of the Saudis, the Pakistanis, and the Talibans, who were created by the money and the training. What fascinated me and
Well, this is at the end of the Charlie Wilson's war kind of period?
Charlie Wilson's period was over in 1990.
Okay.
So
okay.
this is like 6 years after the fact.
Okay, okay.
And poor Charlie Wilson, he was long gone from Congress and all that stuff. And the bottom line was that orphans, they were targeting orphans or kids that only had mothers and no fathers and turning them into psycho killers based on religion, which is not part of Afghan culture, and it really isn't part of the Quran what they were doing. It was more the psychology, forensic psychology, is that if you abuse a child,
Okay.
that they will become possible psychotics, especially sexually abused children. And the one thing no one wanted to talk about is how these predators in the religious training camps in Pakistan were sexually abusing these kids. Because the one thing that keyed me into this is that when in Kabul, the police that walked the street with the steel rods that beat up women, if a woman's foot, even if she was totally covered, hit the ground and you could hear a sound, they would beat her with a steel rod because she wasn't even supposed to be heard.
This is under the Taliban
Under
control.
the Taliban control,
okay.
which the U.S. was tacitly supporting by not opposing.
Okay, I follow this. Right.
And the thing I asked people, what do these guys look like anyway? Tell me about them. And they say, oh, they wear eye makeup, they wear jewelry, they wear false nails. I thought, my God, these guys are transsexuals or, they've been sexually abused. They don't know their own sexual identity. And then I found out, because I started asking more and more questions, that the Talibans would blame their mothers. Their mother couldn't protect them.
Okay.
And they would do this like reverse psychology. It's not the person that buggered you, but it's your mother's fault because she couldn't protect you.
Wow.
Just totally evil.
And that type of sexual abuse was designed to do what with those boys?
Turn them into psycho killers because they hated themselves.
And that type of sexual abuse that you saw going on in Afghanistan when you were there in the 1990s was then.
I wasn't in Kabul.
Okay.
But I was getting lots and lots and lots of it. I was more periphery with the resistance.
Okay.
But not providing any weapons because we weren't allowed to by U.S. law, and I was in U.S. government at that time.
Okay.
Through the Congress.
And what was your position in the Congress?
My position in Congress was special assistant to the ranking member of the Asia Subcommittee, who was Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. I was on a special counter-proliferation group with Vice Chairman Kurt Weldon of the Armed Services Committee, and I was also kind of an informal advisor to Ben Gilman, who was chairman of the International Relations Committee.
Okay, what is the connection between your work in the mid-1990s and learning about this sexual abuse of the young Afghan boys under the Taliban? What's the connection between that and your work in the Philippines in the southern?
They're not the same culture because the communities are coherent in the Philippines. There's been a war going on there since the late 1960s.
Okay.
But there has not been, in Afghanistan, 2/3 of the population became refugees and displaced. Communities.
2/3?
2/3.
Good Lord.
That's why the Pakistanis could take such advantage of this situation, because the communities were totally fragmented and so many men were killed that there were women who didn't have rights, who had boys that they couldn't fully take care of,
Okay.
that the Taliban took, abused, and then blamed their mothers.
Boy.
In Philippines, I felt there was more of a chance to do something good because you had stable, coherent communities. Violence, yes. But there wasn't the sense, because if somebody tried to hurt somebody's child,
Right.
it's a blood feud.
Okay, but in the Philippines,
In the Philippines, it's a blood feud.
at-
When the men are alive, it's a blood feud. In Afghanistan, and this is one thing I've seen the Taliban say, hey, look, we're looking for the boys who don't have fathers, because then no one can protect them. They're ours. And we
Okay.
can blame their mothers.
was there a time in your work in the southern Philippines around 9/11 when this Abu Sayyaf, when there were young Filipino boys that went to Afghanistan and had this type of sexual
I
abuse?
was doing, no, I don't think they were, because the foreigners they wouldn't do that to. The foreigners were trained in Kashmir, the Holy War, Sacred War,
Okay.
or they'd go into Afghanistan for jihad. If they buggered somebody, that was their business. But what they were doing to the Afghans was they were creating, it's like the Hitler Youth, a select group,
Really?
a select group of especially psychotic young people that would do the bidding of Al Qaeda.
Okay, and this big picture, Al, in talking about mediating in zones of terror, what is the building block for you in your career, or the golden nugget that comes out of
During that period, it was
learning
it was
about this?
keeping the tribal groups that were out of Taliban control, keeping them alive. Keeping them alive through food, emergency food drops, through blankets in the heart of winter, through whatever protection.
Basic human necessities.
Basic human necessities. And we had some very courageous small NGOs and a larger one like AmeriCares. I give AmeriCares total, homage for this. That they would get in these decrepit, awful Russian airplanes that they would rent out of Tajikistan or somewhere.
Okay.
And in the middle of winter, fly into these mountains and do food drops and land the airplanes on remote airstrips and drop off blankets and things to keep communities alive.
And who was the United States paying for that type
No.
of aid?
No, it was all private.
Private donors.
Yes.
So this comes back to the
It
point
was-
that you made earlier about the civilian or the NGOs
Yeah, it was-
maintaining a consistent
A
policy.
consistent policy when U.S. policy was flat wrong and destructive. And this is when they started using the drone attacks in the Philippines. I was dead set against it. And it's wrong to do things because they didn't understand what they were doing. There's a lot of stuff that goes on that if people wouldn't be so arrogant, just because they've got money and they're working in government, that they think they can push everybody around. The one thing with Team B, and let me emphasize this to the PACOM people, why Team B worked is because Ronald Reagan was a humble person, and the people that he chose, those very strong, powerful people who won the Cold War, also were humble. They weren't arrogant. They weren't proud. They didn't prance around like we are the world's only superpower. It was like, wow, we're in a tough fight with the Russians. In the same way we should be admitting we're in a tough fight with the extremists, as well as with this next tough fight coming with the Chinese, and you have to develop some humility. And it has nothing to do with whether or not you're being strong. Your strength comes from your ability to understand your own strengths and weaknesses and to respect your allies.
You're watching Asia in Review, and we're talking about mediating in zones of terror and what it takes to do that, what are the real building blocks, and how this came about, that Mr. Al Santoli could be so successful with his organization, Asia America Initiative, in the violence-torn areas of the southern Philippines. He's about to receive a presidential order from President Aquino in the Philippines, and we've been talking about various time periods in his career that have really all been building blocks to the expertise that you now hold. Al, as I listen to these, we've got a couple more building blocks to put into place, but I listen to these, I can't help but think that, you were talking about being in the Vietnam War, and in situations in combat, you have to say to yourself, God has a plan as to why certain people make it through and certain people don't. And it's certainly obvious to me, and I'm sure to our viewers, that in your situation, with all of these experiences, God certainly has had a plan with you, and thank God for that.
But one thing I'll also thank God for is that I was exposed to a group like the Taliban who take that idea to the worst extreme possible, which is that they feel that God is talking to them. It's very difficult to mediate with psychos who think that the voices inside their heads they're hearing is God instead of their own dementia. And this is where there always has to be balance when you're doing these kind
Right.
of very tough battles, where you're dealing with people who are evil. There is such a thing as evil in this world. You can give people a chance to prove that they're not, but when it reaches a certain point, that's why we are not anti-military and we're not anti-police. It's just everything has to be done in a way by which there's balance, equity, and some humility, because otherwise it becomes counterproductive in the other direction. We don't want to be identified in the same light like the Taliban or like other people or the Chinese for that matter. It's so difficult when you try to tell somebody about Tibet or Xinjiang province in China, persecution of dissidents, if people can talk about the United States doing things like torture, this, that, and the other. So rather than using the word democracy, because democracy has so many connotations now, we have to use terms like equity, civil liberties, respect, mutual respect, these kinds of things.
Are those the terms that you use when you're operating with the Muslim communities on Mindanao or in Zamboanga, for instance?
We have to, because if you look at democracy in the Philippines, in some places it works and in some places it's about buying votes. And so if you use the word democracy, what comes to people's head is the little electric fan they got from the local politician to vote for them, or the ghost voters, or the T-shirts.
Okay.
So what we have to do is clean up the word democracy to what, when democracy started as a revolutionary term by our founding fathers, it was to have a positive connotation.
Right.
Even Korea, the Democratic Republic of North Korea, the most ludicrous terms, but the word democracy right now has so many connotations that what we try to do is work the positive traits of democracy back into the original American meaning of the word, which is equity, which
Right.
is that you can be at the bottom and have the same rights as someone who's born into wealth, that there's not this issue of caste systems and someone is just for the rest of their life doomed because of the family they were born into.
You mentioned in our prior episode, you had this fascinating position, I guess it's in the 1990s, as working as a congressional investigator. And during that period of time, I'm sure there were some other component pieces to building the knowledge base or what's in your heart, building your passion. And one of those that I believe you had some involvement with is in missing persons, MIA type activities. And tell us about that. What kind of stuff were you doing with that?
Starting in the early 1980s, I was an assistant to the chairman of the Select House Committee on POW MIAs. At that time, it was Bob Dornan from California.
Okay.
And then later, when he became chairman of the Military Personnel Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, I worked with Bob to rewrite the 1941 Missing Service Personnel Act, which sets the laws and the regulations of when someone goes missing, how the government accounts for them.
Al, right now, one of our viewers watching this program out there is sitting on the edge of her sofa or his sofa, watching this program, and they're saying to me intuitively, ask him about POWs from the Vietnam War. Did we get them all back? Do you know the answer to that question?
The question is, would anybody be alive today? I don't know. Were people left behind after World War II, after even World War I, after the Archangel expedition, when the Russian turned communist, there were people that were left behind. Korean War, none of the wounded were returned. Only the full-bodied were returned.
Okay.
And there were many eyewitness accounts of people that were on trucks that the North Koreans held back. Vietnam,
What can you
there was a
tell?
lot of, I mean, you can't say that you know anybody is alive today. Because remember, when I was doing that work, especially, that was in the early to mid 1990s. And that's already 15 years ago.
Yeah, but at that time, we had what many Americans believe is all of the POWs were returned, and those were the representations coming by our
The
government.
Vietnamese never fully accounted. But you can't say, and again, if it's a family member, and there have been, back then, we knew wives that for 20 years never remarried out of loyalty to not wanting to betray their husband if they were still alive, whether it be Vietnam, Laos, or even Korea. There were kids that were born that never knew their father, who went missing before they came out of their mother. And our premise on the subcommittee and in the hearings we held was to keep faith with the missing men and also with their family members. And we would never rule out that we could say that everyone was returned unless it could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt if there was a situation where someone was last known alive. And that's why we rewrote we felt the best thing we could do is try to build fail-safe into the law so that there would always be adequate records protection, including the military being required to have a legal counsel in absentia for anyone who was known to have been at some point in enemy hands or not proven as dead, so that any classified information would be known by that military JAG officer, and that if it wasn't something that threatened national security to the extreme, that information could be passed along to the most immediate family member.
What's the answer to that lady's question? She wants to know.
It's an unfair thing to ask at this time because the war has been over for so long, and I would never be in a position. And the one thing we felt back then even was to provide any kind of misleading information or false hope, or pessimism that was undue.
Okay.
So I mean, right now I would have to go back into, and I don't have a security clearance.
Yeah, I understand.
And that's the key thing. So
What's-
it would be very unfair to try to address that question.
What's the gold nugget that comes out of this work with MIAs during your work on this congressional subcommittee for you now? What is that piece of passion, piece of emotion, piece of intellectual knowledge that you now carry with you that allows you to do this incredible work that you do?
It's loyalty. It's really about loyalty. And I mean, the one thing, and that stems from the infantry, which is that you don't leave your dead and wounded or missing on the battlefield, that you make sometimes it's impossible, but you still make every possible effort. And for those of us, Bob Dornan, he was a fighter pilot. He was a Korean era veteran, not Korean War veteran, but the best man at his wedding, David Herdlicka, was one of the first Americans who went missing in Laos, and his bones were never recovered, and he was last photographed alive in Vietnamese Army hands.
Interesting.
And so for Chairman Dornan, the motivating factor in all of this was he had a very personal connection
Sure.
to Dave Herdlicka.
Sure.
So, and my feeling in it was, wait a minute, what if it was me? What if instead of being wounded one of those times I was captured? Would I want people just to say, oh, he's dead? Let's forget about him? In the same way that when I came down with cancer in the middle of this work, and I wasn't given a lot of months to live, and that was 3 years ago, and there were some people that said, well, don't fund him because he's going to die anyway from cancer.
Yeah.
Well, here I am.
There you are. And you're so greatly appreciated, not only in this country, but in the Philippines where you do your work. Let's go back now to your work on this congressional subcommittee. There's another part of your work that I suspect is a big gold nugget in there in terms of things that you learned, and that has to do with your work involving Osama bin Laden on this congressional subcommittee, or Osama bin Laden's rise. And so, tell the audience about that. What's that all about?
Well, for those of us that knew Afghanistan, we felt that it wasn't simply a matter of some cult leader in the mountains, but that he had some very powerful backing behind him, i.e. the Saudi intelligence led by Prince Faisal Turki and the Pakistani military intelligence led by Hamid Gul. On top of that, when you have the Chinese military writing about him as being one of the most significant threats this book was about how do you defeat the United States. I mean, the context of the Chinese
Now, this is a
doctrinal book,
PLA
published by PLA Publishing
Let's
House.
give the audience the title one more time so they can.
Well, the English language title was Unrestricted Warfare.
Unrestricted Warfare.
I had a copy of the book while in Congress in both Chinese, and then there were people that did English translation out
Okay.
of the Chinese.
Okay.
And I had 2 or 3 different translations done so that I could be sure of the accuracy of the translation. But there were 2 things that the Chinese said in this book that were highly significant. Remember, this book was written right after the Taiwan incident in 96.
1996. Okay.
And also the bombing of their embassy by a cruise missile in was that Serbia or Kosovo? Serbia.
Serbia.
And they wanted revenge. The 2 heroes of the book were not only Osama bin Laden, but George Soros. And George Soros was a hero to them because Soros took down the British economy and a couple of economies in smaller countries in Asia as one man doing currency manipulation. And if you read that section of the book, it's fascinating because they say, well, heck, if Soros as one man could take down an entire country's currency, imagine what we could do with an eye toward the United States.
Okay. Okay.
And remember, this was the mid to late 90s. Who owns the majority of our debt right now?
China.
So, I mean, it's suicidal that during the Reagan period, people would have read this and they would have taken it seriously. People like Roger Robinson, who was very much a part of Reagan's economic team that took down the Soviet Union, people like John Linchowsky, others whose names are not familiar, but they were people that worked National Security Council and other areas that were responsible as those unknown quiet heroes that helped to win the Cold War through non-military means. The military means played a big part in it.
What is the kind of the gold nugget now that comes out of your work in this congressional subcommittee on the rise of Osama bin Laden? What comes out
We
of
didn't
that?
do that through subcommittee. We did that because we knew Afghanistan. And because we were on the Foreign Relations Committee, it allowed us to travel and do things.
All right, but what I'm getting at is what's the value that comes out of that period of your career that you now use with AAI in the Southern Philippines?
Well, the important thing was that I could see the way that Afghanistan was being approached in 2001, 2002, that it was not going to succeed because they were trying to create a central government out of a non-existent entity.
Okay.
And the person they
Okay.
chose to run it
Karzai.
was a bad puppet
Okay.
and a thief and a crook. And his brother is heavily involved in opium dealing. So put all that together, and it's like Win Van Thieu or somebody, he's worse than Win Van Thieu actually, in Vietnam. If you make a comparison with Vietnam, why are we still playing games with these so-called puppets who are loyal to no one but themselves? And Afghanistan is a tribal country. You have to deal with all of the tribes in a way that's decentralized. Putting billions of dollars into the hands of someone who no one respects, that's why I felt, okay, let's deal with a place that has an existing government where even if there's a civil war and a religious war going on, you can still mediate and work with people In Afghanistan, extremely difficult because it's a fragmented tribal society.
But in the early 2000s, right after 9/11, the southern Philippines had a problem for a period of time with a group called the Abu Sayyaf.
But it was different because
Were they connected with Osama bin Laden in some way?
remotely. I mean, bin Laden's brother-in-law was there because bin Laden married a local girl to try to gain more recruits. Didn't
Okay.
work because for two reasons. One is because we created enough social programs
Okay.
to stop that.
So AAI in effect was involved in blocking the ability to
Yeah.
recruit.
Yeah, and in Basilan, where they were bringing kidnap victims, that's where the U.S. military had the center of their operation,
Okay.
which in Congress we helped to keep alive. And they could fight the Abu Sayyaf in Basilan. In Holo, where there was no U.S. military at that time, we used the social economic development,
Of the AI.
AAI, it was supported by the Philippine government, because we couldn't have done it without support of the President of the Philippines and the Secretary of Defense. In Basilan, which is about 60, 70 miles north, is where the U.S. had special forces trying to rescue kidnapped victims, and they killed some of the original.
Okay.
But that hasn't stopped the war. It only killed some criminals. That's important to kill the criminals. But on the other hand, if you're going to have long-standing peace, stability, and security, you have to deal with the whole issue of social economic, not just the police action. So there has to be always balance and symmetry.
And as you mentioned that, as I look back on the discussion that we've just had in this part of the program as well as the first episode, now I can see, and I hope, ladies and gentlemen, you can start to see how these pieces begin to fit together. And again, let's go back to your time in Congress before you started AAI, and talk about another area that you worked on, and I believe that was in the area of the looking at the rise of China and how that might impact the United States.
Yeah, it was to me, you judge a country by the way it treats its people. The persecution of Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists, and even party members like the Falun Gong. The Falun Gong, that's the largest persecution that has been known in China is of the Falun Gong, like yoga practitioners. That movement was started by the Chinese government because they didn't want to create health care for older people.
Okay.
So they say you do traditional Chinese exercises, it builds up the energy in your body, and this way you don't have to see a doctor, and then we don't have to pay for it. Well, what happened is that when you start to look in traditional Chinese anything, there's always philosophy involved, and there's an inherent spirituality.
Sure.
And this bit the communist right in the backside. And because most of the people practicing were party members.
All right.
They were retired party members.
All right.
And they gave their life to communism. And they started realizing that a handful had become very rich, and they were doing these exercises because the other people were so corrupt that they wouldn't even help them get the most rudimentary medical care. So they started doing silent, nonviolent protest outside of the Chinese parliament.
Okay.
And they started torturing, arresting, mass arresting, and torturing these old, incredibly devoted party members, beating them to a pulp. And I thought, my God, if they will treat their own devoted party members like animals, imagine what they would do to outsiders, because, this is not a generality, it's the truth. The Chinese are very biased and prejudiced to outsiders. The Han Chinese are very much that way. And that's why they call everybody in their language devils. There's a white devil, a black devil, a red devil. It's not a place where there's equity within the society. And with them developing a powerful military, and especially after they were so upset over the standoff in Taiwan in '96, this is very, very dangerous.
This is when the United States sent the 7th Fleet in between Taiwan and China during their face-off to
And they felt humiliated. You were in Taiwan at that time,
right,
huh?
right. So let's let's take this rise of China that you were exposed to and you worked on during your congressional subcommittee years, and
Actually, before that, I started working on that way back in the 1980s because I encountered the Chinese in Cambodia.
well, the important part, Al, is what is the gold nugget for your work in the southern Philippines with Asia America Initiative today that comes as a consequence of that understanding and development and work with the involving the rise of China? What's the gold nugget there for?
Well, if we look at what's happening today with the American Seventh Fleet moving back to Vietnam and the Philippines because the Chinese are claiming all territories in the big body of water that now is being called all kinds of names, but the Chinese call the South China Sea and the East Sea.
The Vietnamese call the East Sea.
Well, the Japanese also have the issue going on further north that, again, it comes down to if you're going to be abusive of your own retired party members, why would you treat your neighbors with any more civility?
Well, have you had to deal with the rise of China in your work in the southern Philippines?
They're running all kinds of drugs into there now, all kinds of methamphetamines to soften the place up.
The Chinese are?
Yeah. The Chinese military control the methamphetamine trade in the region.
You're talking about the PLA now?
PLA. The
PLA.
methamphetamines the chemicals originate on Chinese military bases. They hand it off to organized crime runs it into neighboring countries because it destabilizes the country so that it adds another element of inability to resist Chinese aggression.
Well, this area that you operate in with your NGO in
It's
southern
flooded
Philippines.
now with methamphetamines
Flooded from the Philippines,
from China.
from China, all right? And so what's the strategic advantage to China? I mean, this is a poor area,
They're the toughest
radically
fighters.
controlled.
They're the toughest fighters, and they're the best boatmen. And the Chinese right now are claiming the gas and oil right off Philippine coastline, which is in the Sultanate area of the main tribe that I work with.
So the Chinese are afraid of the tribal communities coming after them?
Because they can fight them. Because they don't need GPS. They navigate by the stars. They're afraid of absolutely nothing. And if you look at, the Chinese know the lessons of history. During the war against the Japanese in World War II, it was the tribal people and the guerrillas that gave the Japanese fits until the Americans could get rebuilt after
Corregidor.
Pearl Harbor, after Corregidor, and,
Right.
and in Burma the same thing. Merrill's Marauders work with the tribal people.
So this zone of terror that you operate in, we're talking about, by the way, if you've just joined us, mediating in zones of terror with the mediator himself, Mr. Al Santoli, in this violent-stricken area of the world. So that the Chinese are kind of the shadow in the background that you see in the work that you do in the Philippines.
They're the shadow in the background of everything in the region because they're the biggest country. And they have had up to now more resources, and they've undergone an unprecedented military buildup. Unprecedented. Including, this is the first time they've had a blue water navy since the 16th century. And the sea territories they're claiming now, they go back to Ming Dynasty. Say, it's ours. You know, when we had a navy, we controlled it. Here's our maps. Sorry, guys, it's ours.
And what's the response to that?
It's fragmented. You can see lately what happened this week in the meeting of the Southeast Asian countries. The Chinese have Cambodia in the palm of their hand. There needed to be consensus. There couldn't be consensus because Cambodia sided with China.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a strategic advantage other than the not having problems with oil and gas exploration? Is there a strategic advantage to the Chinese?
Food.
Food.
I mean, the Chinese are running out of food.
And so what's that connection with the area in the southern Philippines?
There's a lot of food there and potential food and fisheries.
Boy.
It's a very, very dangerous time. When we started doing this in 2002, that was not the immediate consideration. The immediate consideration was the religious war and the possibility of more of that spreading from Pakistan across the entire region.
This is the development of a Islamic caliphate across the
Yes,
region.
yes.
Okay.
Now the issue is much more significant, which is not the rise of China, but the aggression of China.
And so what do you see in terms of that causes you concern in terms of food supplies in this poor area
I'll
of the
give you an
southern Philippines?
example. Over the conflict over who's going to control the oil and gas, the Philippines had trusted China. They had 200,000 farmers grow nothing but bananas and ship all those bananas to one place, China. When the row started over the gas and oil, guess what China did? They immediately canceled the contract. So 200,000 farmers were left destitute. Their bananas rotted in the port. We're providing seeds now for some of those farmers to be able to grow vegetable gardens so they could feed their families. My little organization is doing that.
Boy, this is scary times that we live in an area of the world
That's economic warfare. And that's what they talked about in the book Unrestricted Warfare, that economic warfare would be a key component. So with us, they would use the holding of our debt. With the other countries, it would be dependency on their market.
Have you seen Chinese investments into these islands of the southern Philippines?
Yes.
What-
Yes,
what
but for
kinds
them,
of-
when they invest, they take. It's not for the benefit of communities. For instance, the Dole plantation, Del Monte, not Dole, forgive me, Dole, Del Monte,
Del Monte.
sold their Bukidnon.
Now, where is this?
This is in the northern part of Mindanao.
Okay.
They sold to a consortium of Filipino Chinese and mainland Chinese, 51%, 49%. When we were there, the National Football Soccer Association is there. We were getting referees and coaches to go into the war areas in the south, further south, to be able to do our Soccer for Peace program.
Mm-hmm.
And the school principal grabbed me and she said, I want you to see something. She said, you see that kid, you see that kid, you see that kid. How old do you think they are?
She's pointing at Filipino kids now.
At Filipino kids. She
Okay.
said, and I said, well, I think they're like 12 or 8 or 7. Well, they were about 3 years older than they look. She said, these kids are so malnourished.
They're dwarfed?
They're not dwarfs, but they're small and scrawny. And she said, do you know why that is? She said, Del Monte was sold to the Chinese. They take all the food to China. Our kids don't have enough to eat.
But this was a formerly a rich
It still
farming
is.
area.
It still is. But the food goes to China because the Chinese own it. The local people go hungry.
So how I mean, you work in this area. What is the NGO, the work that your organization is doing to fight this?
This is national policy on a level that we can't fight it. What we do try to do, and this is we don't have enough funding, is we get seed companies to donate seeds, and we provide it, we call it Gardens of Peace.
Gardens of Peace.
For the local schools and communities to grow community gardens so they can at least have sustenance. Now, where else did I see something like this happen? During the period of the genocide in Cambodia, everybody had to be a slave farmer, right?
Okay.
Everybody was growing rice. There was a zillion tons of rice in Cambodia, but 1 million or 2 million people died from starvation.
This is during the
The
Khmer
Khmer-
Rouge killing fields time.
Where did that rice go?
I have no idea.
It
where.
went to China, because China was advising the Khmer Rouge, and the genocide against the Cambodian people was being appropriated by China to be able to take over the Cambodian rice fields. No one likes to talk about that.
Well, maybe you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Asia in Review, and we're talking about mediating in zones of terror and the incredible complexities that are required of an individual to operate safely in this area, as well as to solve the kinds of problems that these areas encounter. Al, to coming down the home stretch with our program here, what is it that kind of, let's give the viewers here kind of a thumbnail sketch of the various types of things that AAI is doing by way of community development, humanitarian assistance, and all working towards countering any kind of terrorism or
We
violence.
have integrated programs. I would recommend that people look at our website at www.asiaamerica, as one word, asiaamerica.org, O-R-G, and it'll give you a sense of how we integrate education, health, livelihood, and mediation. The issue that we discussed with China, it's like an organic historical development. Our premise for being is to be able to not just mediate with words, but action comes first, and the action comes into people improving their lives. Not that we're giving handouts or we're giving charity, because we don't believe that charity can last, and I've learned this myself, that donors will not stay with you for very long, so you can't rely on charity. That people have the ability by which they can have the confidence. It's not the ability, but the confidence to take care of themselves. Some assistance is needed,
Okay.
no doubt about it, but you want to be able to instill an entrepreneurial mentality in people. And again, you can't have development without peace. And that's one of our main messages. Please, guys, don't kill each other. Focus on developing your economy, focus on developing your communities, work together.
In the last year, your organization, AAI, provided an extraordinary amount of cancer drugs into that region. Do you recall what the dollar amount of that is?
Well, with cancer drugs, well, at least a few $1,000,000 donated by various pharmaceutical companies. But the thing that, for us, we're very cash short, but we did last year about $31 million worth of humanitarian assistance, all donated. We don't touch it, we don't sell it. One of the reasons we get such large donations, whether it be education, health, livelihood, etc., is because people trust that we're not going to abuse the contributions. And we have to work with a small staff. Our overhead is like less than 1%. And the emphasis has been on getting the services to the people. And what we're working on now is making sure that it can be sustainable with training, especially teacher training, livelihood training. We're trying to improve vocational schools. So it's not just giving somebody a short-term handout, but that we're really trying to develop the kind of stability necessary for long-term partnerships. And for the United States, it means strong long-term alliances, which is going to be very important for the future.
Al, I'm going to ask you one last question for this program, and the premise for this question is this: is that, from your earliest experiences abroad as a young soldier operating in remote villages as a part of the people, learning the culture, you're operating in an area now. The NGO Asia America Initiative is operating in an area of terror and violence that has historically been that way for hundreds of years. And one of the things that the organization seems to be about is changing the cultural perceptions of the future generations. And I noticed that one of the ways that you seem to be doing that is with some kind of a children's story or storybook.
Yeah, we're using
system
multimedia.
How does that work?
Well, you create myths, but the myths have to be rooted in people's real situations. So we have a collective of young artists, storytellers, visual people, and publishers that we've put together a storybook about 3 children. One is Christian, one is Muslim, one is from the tribal people, and how they become friends and work together to protect their environment, to do good things for their communities, etc. That's being used now in over 1,000 public schools in an agreement with the Department of Education as part of It both is for language training, it helps to teach English, but also it's about character building and values and peace building.
You know, Al Santoli, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. We hope you've learned a lot about mediating in zones of terror and what it takes to do that. And we'll join you some future program. Thank you for watching.